Receiving an allowance without being expected to do household chores might seem like an ideal situation at first glance. The notion of having more free time while still being financially supported could feel like a dream for many. But when your mother-in-law, Doris, is part of the equation, things become more complicated. At 34, I work as a freelance web designer, a job that I've grown to love, but one that doesn't always garner the respect it deserves in the eyes of Doris. Bobby and I, now married, had hoped that our lives together would be a balance of both career and family, but that balance has been disrupted by Doris's deep-seated views on what a marriage should look like. Our differing opinions on work, roles, and responsibilities at home often clash, especially when it comes to the subject of housework. When I transitioned from a corporate job to freelancing, it was a decision I made for my own well-being, and Bobby was supportive of it. He understood that this shift would allow me to build a steady stream of clients, work more flexibly, and still contribute to the home in ways that were meaningful to me. However, Doris was less than thrilled. To her, a wife's primary role was to take care of the home, to nurture and manage the household with care and dedication. While I worked hard on my freelance projects, she saw my work as insignificant, even frivolous. My income, though steady, didn't measure up to the traditional standard she held dear. In her eyes, a proper wife wouldn't be spending her time working in front of a computer but instead would focus on house chores, cooking, and maintaining the household. It became clear to me that Doris had a very narrow view of what a wife's duties were, and anything outside that scope seemed to be met with resistance. Despite Bobby's support of my career, he often found himself stuck in the middle, unsure how to address the growing tension between his wife and his mother. I, on the other hand, felt increasingly alienated in my own home. It was as though my modern, more flexible approach to life didn't fit into Doris's rigid expectations. The house we lived in was a product of the past, both physically and symbolically. It had been purchased by Bobby's father, and after his passing 4 years ago, Doris had inherited it. While it was spacious and well-maintained, it was also a constant reminder of the way things used to be, especially as Doris would frequently remind me of the traditional family roles she believed should still apply. The house, with its well-defined spaces and expectations, became a battleground for these conflicting ideals. Though I had carved out a small corner for myself to work, the friction between Doris and I was ever present. Her constant criticism and traditionalist views were hard to ignore, but the house also played host to a bustling social life, with Doris's longtime friends coming and going. These gatherings brought a new set of challenges, as I often found myself playing the role of a polite hostess, offering coffee, cakes, and making small talk while trying to stay out of the conversations that revolved around their family dynamics. Doris and her friends, women who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, often found themselves discussing their daughters-in-law with a certain mix of amusement and disdain. The stories they shared were rarely complimentary. I would often listen in, half amused, half saddened, as they recounted their frustrations with their own daughters-in-law. One of their favorite topics was a woman who spent months at her parents' house after every disagreement with her husband. This woman's absence had left her husband to face debt collectors alone, a situation that was clearly a source of endless gossip and judgment. Each friend took turns trying to outdo the other, sharing their own tales of how their daughters-in-law had disrupted family harmony. As the laughter and stories filled the room, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. The way these women found humor in their daughters-in-law's failures, while rarely offering praise or support, highlighted the deep divide between the older generation's expectations and the reality of modern relationships. Compliments for a daughter-in-law were rare, and when one of them was praised for managing her career and home with grace, Doris's immediate response was to downplay the effort. She dismissed it as merely a side job, unable to recognize the value of what I was doing. These conversations, often taking place just steps away from my workspace, were a constant reminder of how my role in the family was perceived. Doris's traditional views clashed harshly with my more modern approach to balancing work and home life. The laughter that filled the room was sometimes laced with a subtle undercurrent of judgment, particularly toward me. Doris would often question the value of my work, openly wondering how much money I was really making. The group would laugh at the idea of a wife needing to contribute financially, clinging to the outdated belief that a husband's income should be the primary source of support for a family. Though I occasionally tried to join in the laughter, I couldn't ignore the slight sting of belittlement that always accompanied these discussions. The more Doris and her friends criticized the role of modern wives, the more I felt the need to retreat into my work. my headphones offering a small act of defiance. I'd focus on my projects, tuning out the noise around me, doing my best to block out the constant reminders of the expectations Doris placed on me. My work became my escape, my way of asserting my independence, even if it meant quietly resisting the old-fashioned views that Doris and her friends clung to. Living in that house, constantly walking the tightrope between maintaining peace with Doris and pursuing my own ambitions, was exhausting. I tried to maintain a balance, working hard to meet deadlines while also keeping up with housework and trying to avoid conflict. But every day felt like a battle between my modern, independent self and the traditional expectations that Doris had for me. Even though I was making strides in my career, I couldn't shake the feeling that, to Doris, I would never be enough, unless I conformed to the narrow role she had defined for me. I reached my breaking point when my mother-in-law, Doris, coldly said, "A daughter-in-law like you should just get out." Her words stung like a slap, not just as an insult, but as a final dismissal of everything I had endured over the years. The weight of all the hurt, frustration, and resentment I'd buried deep inside of me came rushing to the surface. Anger swelled in my chest, and as I looked to Bobby, the man I had once loved, I saw nothing but indifference. His silence and refusal to take a stand only deepened the wound. His constant indecision and failure to address the growing tension had brought us to this point, and in that moment, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Fed up with the situation, I turned to him and said, my voice firm, "Understood. Then I will leave." I walked to my workspace, collected my computer and a few essentials, and headed toward the door. Before I left, I informed Doris that I would return later to gather the rest of my things. Her glare burned into my back, but Bobby, typical of him, was nowhere to be seen, hiding away in his room as if nothing had happened. As I crossed the threshold, Doris's voice followed me, sharp and full of malice. "When you step into this house again, it will be after signing the divorce papers." Her words hit me like a slap, the cruel finality of them hanging in the air. I walked away in stunned silence, unable to process the depth of the cruelty I'd just witnessed. I had never felt such disdain from her before. I didn't know where else to go, so I sought refuge at my parents' home. I felt shaken, unsure of what my next steps should be. When my mother saw me, she immediately sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Struggling to explain everything in full, I shared my regrets, how Bobby had changed from the man who once cherished me, how the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Talking it through with my parents was cathartic, though still overwhelming. With no children complicating matters, my mother suggested I consider divorce sooner rather than later, especially given my financial independence. Her words felt like the first sense of clarity I'd had in a long time. Over the weekend, with my father's quiet support, I began to take the first steps toward ending the chapter of my life that had been weighed down by pain and uncertainty. Though the future felt uncertain, there was a glimmer of peace in the thought of moving forward with self-respect and independence. I gathered my things and moved out of the house I had once shared with Bobby and his mother. They both seemed to avoid the confrontation that was now inevitable. As I stood outside Bobby's room, I spoke softly, almost to myself, "You took care of me for a long time. Can you sign the divorce papers?" I slipped the documents under the door and waited. His response was as indifferent as I expected, "I've signed it. We're done here." Retrieving the signed papers felt hollow, the act of finalizing our divorce offering no real sense of triumph, only the bitter realization that our marriage was truly over. I left the house without speaking to Doris, the sadness heavy in my chest. 3 years in that home, and most of the memories were tainted by resentment and hurt. I knew it was time to move on. I took the signed papers straight to the city office to submit them, hoping that once it was official, I could finally close this painful chapter in my life. My plan was to move back in with my parents temporarily, to rebuild and regain some sense of normalcy while continuing my work from there. As I settled into this new, solitary chapter of my life, my mother suggested I stay with them for a while. It would be less worrying than living alone, she said, her concern palpable. My father also voiced his worries, cautioning that Bobby and Doris might unexpectedly visit. At first, I thought such visits seemed unlikely, but living with my parents turned out to be exactly what I needed. Their home was a place of calm and familiarity, a space where I could process the changes and regroup. The flexibility of my freelance job allowed me to work remotely, and I found that staying with my parents not only provided comfort but also allowed me to regain some semblance of peace. 3 months passed, and though the memories of Bobby and Doris began to fade into the distance, my life still felt uncertain. That was when an unfamiliar number flashed on my phone. At first, I hesitated, unsure whether it was a wrong number or an unwelcome connection from my past. But after several persistent calls, I finally answered, only to hear Bobby's frantic voice on the other end. "Why don't you answer the phone?" he asked, sounding confused. I was prepared to end the conversation immediately, but his next question caught me off guard. "Wait a minute, why isn't my smartphone working?" he asked, sounding genuinely perplexed. With little patience, I suggested he contact the mobile company. But then something clicked in my mind. I asked him if he had been making regular deposits into the bank account we once shared. We had always contributed to it together, my steady income and his unpredictable health product sales. Normally, I topped it off at the end of each month, but for the past 4 months, only his contributions had been coming in. I realized that I had left in the middle of the month, and that the new car loan payments may have started. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I calmly stated, "I've been managing our household expenses with my income until now. From this point forward, please take care of your living expenses." I wanted to say more, something biting like, "You reap what you sow," but I held it back. The conversation ended quietly. As I reflected on the phone call, it dawned on me that Bobby had never been fully transparent about his earnings, particularly to Doris. She seemed unaware that my salary had been the primary support for the household since we'd married. Perhaps he had been too embarrassed to admit that his wife was the one carrying the financial burden. The fact that something as basic as the mobile phone service had been the first expense to be cut showed just how little responsibility he had taken for anything. It was yet another sign of the deeper issues that had plagued our relationship, the avoidance of responsibility, the lack of transparency, and the emotional distance that had grown between us.